Citywide elections finally arriving in Jacksonville. Today, we have the impact of the votes this week and analysis on how many people decided to cast ballots or stay home instead. Chris Hand joins us for our Hand on Government segments, plus the latest from Tallahassee in the legislative session. That includes the controversial 6-week abortion ban. Stay with us for This Week in Jacksonville. Thank you for being with us today. Municipal elections in the consolidated city of Jacksonville taking place this week. Many races are decided. Some need another election in about 7 weeks. Government law attorney Chris Hand is with us for our monthly segment. And Chris, so you've been involved in the process. You've been in the trenches for campaigns. Broadly speaking, tell us about this year's election here in Jacksonville.
Well, I think in many ways, Kent, what defines this election is what didn't happen more than what did. And of course, what didn't happen is that 75% of the nearly 700,000 registered voters in this county did not cast ballots on or before the March 21st first election. And obviously that's concerning, that an election of this magnitude, one in which we're electing a new mayor, a new property appraiser, a new city council, was only decided by a quarter of the registered voters in this county. And there's probably a number of reasons for that, Kent. One may be voter fatigue. Remember, it was just 4 months ago that people here in Jacksonville, along with the rest of the state, elected a new governor, a U.S. senator, a cabinet. So there may be some voter fatigue having these big elections just 4 months later. But it also may have something to do with the harshly negative tone of the first election campaign. As we know, there were a lot of negative ads going back and forth, probably more so than any other municipal election in the history of the consolidated city of Jacksonville. That too may have suppressed turnout in leading to these results last night.
So let's talk about results and let's talk about that issue. Here's where the run for mayor ended up. Donna Deegan with 39% of the vote, Daniel Davis 25% of the vote, Al Ferrero and then Audrey Gibson next. But these first two, the top two vote getters here, go to the May 16th runoff election. Let's talk a little bit about that negative tone, though. So certainly on TV, and we've got kind of a sampling of some of the negative ads that were running on TV. We saw that at the top of the ticket. But there were flyers going out to mailboxes for city council races, for property appraiser, whatever it was all over, not just these top races, right?
Well, if you own a television, or if you check the mail, right, or if you log on to the internet, or if you receive text messages here in this city, you probably knew there was an election going on, because all of those different media were just flooded with messaging from different candidates. And as you say, we had not only a race for mayor, but a race for property appraiser, council races, both at large and individual district races. So there was a ton of communication. And admittedly, with that many different candidates running, it can be very hard to sort out who's running for what and who stands for what. One of the benefits of now moving to this second round is, as the voters have now winnowed down those different fields, that has a clarifying effect. There's a very clear choice. There's no more than two candidates in every race that's going to be on the ballot. So for mayor, voters have a very clear choice, Donna Deegan or Daniel Davis, and they have very different positions on a variety of issues facing the public right now. Property appraiser, two very different choices, Joyce Morgan and Jason Fisher. The same is true for the council races that are still on the ballot. So there is a great clarifying effect when you get down to two voters, and hopefully what that will foster is some better discussion and engagement on those crucial issues facing the city of Jacksonville for the next 4 years.
You mentioned that property appraiser. We just saw results a moment ago. Joyce Morrison was so close. I mean, it was pretty close. She got within that 2 percentage points. And in this first election, you need to get 50% plus one. So close. How does that change the dynamic when we go to this next election, this runoff election? Are there differences that candidates have to make in a race like that?
Well, I think there's a variety of factors. First of all, important to remember that it's kind of like in the NFL where you finish the regular season and the playoff starts a whole new season. Yeah. Very much true in this context as well. We're done with the first election. You can't look at the second election as a continuation of the first election. It's a brand new election with new dynamics. So every campaign now has to take a step back and think about, how do I use the tools of voter turnout and the tools of voter persuasion to help make sure that I receive a majority or that campaign receives a majority on May the 16th. So I think every campaign's probably going through that evaluation process right now. How do we cobble together the right kind of coalition of Democrats, Republicans, maybe even some NPA or no party affiliation voters can be decisive in these contests? Every campaign right now is going through that strategic planning process. How do we get the number of votes we need to be successful?
One of the strategic processes I believe the campaigns are going to go through now is, okay, what are our resources and how do we deploy them? So we know that there was a big spending gap when we look just at the run for mayor. Chris, 4 Republicans, 2 Democrats, no party affiliated, and a qualified write-in candidate. But the spending gap between the GOP candidates and the Democratic Party, somebody calculated at roughly $10 million to $1 million. So what does that say about local parties? And we saw a very high fundraising campaign in Leanna Cumber that didn't succeed at the level that you would necessarily expect. So what are the chances for the parties as they go into this runoff election?
I think that's going to be a key question in this runoff election is what is the resource and the communication disparity between not just the two parties, but I think more specifically the two candidates for mayor. Remember, that race at the top of the ballot has a significant impact, not just in that contest, but also down the ballot. So if there is a resource disparity in the mayor's contest, that could have implications for other contests on the ballot as well. So that'll be a key issue to watch going forward. How much is Daniel Davis's campaign and related political committees going to raise and invest? How much is Donna Deegan's campaign and related political committees, or political parties for that matter, going to raise and invest? If it's anything like recent mayor's races, we can expect a significant amount of investment in the millions of dollars between now and May the 16th on all sides.
One of the things we talked about on election night during our coverage is that a key endorsement may play out if it comes from the governor's office to put a stamp on or a thumb on the mayor's race here in Jacksonville.
That's certainly one, and it's unclear at this point what Governor DeSantis's involvement is going to be. He won this county in November during his reelection bid. It's not clear yet how he's going to engage. It seems likely that he will engage in some way, whether that's an endorsement of Daniel Davis or other campaign activities he might undertake. I think there's another set of endorsements that's going to be interesting to watch going forward. There were several mayoral candidates who ran but did not win in this first election. Obviously, that was Al Ferraro, Audrey Gibson, and Leanna Cumber, probably the third, fourth, and fifth place finishers in this contest. I would imagine right now that both the Deegan and the Davis campaigns are doing a lot of outreach to those third, fourth, and fifth place finishers, and even more importantly, to their supporters to try and bring them on board and help assemble the coalition that will elect one of them the next mayor of Jacksonville.
For campaigns, help us get inside what the mindset would be. At this point, we say, okay, now it's one-on-one here in the battle here. Do you now transition to, it's got to be about the ideas, or is it still almost personality driven like it seemed to be in this first election?
Every election is its own election, is unique in that way. I think there's a couple of imperatives. Each of these candidates is going to try and define themselves for the voters. Again, like we talked about earlier, Kent, it's hard to do that in a 7-candidate field like we had in the first election. That narrowing it down to 2 candidates has a very clarifying effect on the field. So I think you're going to see both Donna Deegan and Daniel Davis work very hard now to try to define themselves to voters, help give voters a sense of what they'll do as mayor, but they're also going to try to define the choice. Yeah. Every election's a choice, in this case between 2 candidates. Voters go into the voting poll or cast their mail ballot, reflecting upon that choice. So I think you'll also see both campaigns try to frame up that choice between Donna Deegan and Daniel Davis.
Just briefly before we move on to state politics, the voter turnout was so disappointing to so many people. How does that change? What changes that for what happens in May so that more people turn out?
Well, I think the campaigns are largely going to drive that, and some of their outside supporters. Number one, giving people a reason to go to the polls. I think that always is helpful when voters on either side feel inspired and motivated to go vote for whatever reason. That tends to help voter turnout. Some of that harsh negative advertising we saw in the first election, I think, has the propensity to depress or suppress turnout at times. I also think probably going forward, there are going to be some efforts on the part of both campaigns to specifically target voter turnout, figure out who's likely to support them, and make sure those voters go out to the polls. I think that's particularly important for the Deegan campaign. If you analyze some of the voter turnout in the first election, a lot of the voters who didn't turn out were Democratic voters. And so I think the Deegan campaign is going to be particularly focused on trying to make sure maybe that some people who didn't vote the first time around do vote the second time around.
All right. Our Hand on Government segment today. It's going to continue in a moment. Chris is staying here, and we invite you to stay with us as we travel west on Interstate 10 for the next segment. I'll look at what's going on during the 2023 legislative session in Florida. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
The government law attorney Chris Hand is with us. So let's talk about state politics here. A 60-day legislative session is underway since the beginning of this month. Lots of bills moving pretty quickly through this process. Key bills could be universal school vouchers, a so-called constitutional carry, concealed weapons proposal, higher educational changes. But you pointed out something that I thought was important. There are at least 3 bills that are working through the process right now, which you believe could have a huge impact on the city of Jacksonville budget.
Well, and it's that acronym we've talked about a lot in recent years, JEA, which it could impact our electric and water utility here in the city of Jacksonville. Kent, as you know, each year, because JEA owns a lot of property in Jacksonville, but it's a public entity, so it doesn't pay property taxes. Well, in lieu of that property tax contribution.
This is the trade-off, right?
Yeah, JEA gives a contribution to the city of Jacksonville each year, which right now is about $122 million. That is a huge portion of the city of Jacksonville budget. Well, there is a bill now going through the legislature which proposes to put some limitations, some caps on transfers from municipally owned utilities to cities like Jacksonville. There are, I think, more than 30 communities in Florida that have their own public utilities, so this could impact a number of them, but most specifically, depending on what this legislation looks like, could have a significant impact here in Jacksonville. If that transfer from JEA significantly decreases, the next mayor and the next city council, and we were just talking about the potential for people to be the next mayor and next city council, could face some very difficult fiscal choices. For example, the current mayor of Tallahassee, John Daly, testified before the legislature this past week, and he said that if this bill went into effect, the city of Tallahassee would have a very significant gap in its budget and might have to actually raise taxes, raise property taxes in order to make that up. I think that's a concern for every city in the state of Florida that owns a utility, city of Jacksonville specifically, because again, each year JEA makes a $122 million contribution. If that goes away, the mayor and city council have to make some very tough choices to balance the budget.
Yeah, for context, that 120 million or what have you. So it's a little bit less than 10% of the entire budget.
That's exactly
for the whole city here. Let's talk a little bit about this. I know one of the big topics that is going on, Republicans have a supermajority in the Florida legislature, so GOP efforts may face resistance, but not enough to change the outcomes necessarily. I spoke with Jacksonville's only Democrat in the Senate about the abortion bill that's moving through the process right now. Tracy Davis spoke with me, and she says she's completely against that bill.
It's really, really important for folks to know how we've criminalized our medical professionals and how this bill simply endangers our medical professionals and our moms and their babies, because it takes such a drastic approach to a safe, legal, medical procedure that simply should be a decision the woman makes with her family and her doctor.
So, Chris, this is adding to the state's 15-week abortion ban, moving that timeline down to 6 weeks. This seems like a Republican-led effort that isn't going to be derailed by Democratic opposition because there aren't enough Democrats to make a stand or to keep it from happening. Is that accurate?
Well, what may derail it is the Florida Constitution. Kent, as you may know, in the Florida Constitution, which voters passed in 1980 in the aftermath of the Roe v. Wade decision, voters adopted a right to privacy specific to Florida in the state constitution. That right to privacy was passed in the aftermath of Roe v. Wade to try and make sure Florida had some of the privacy protections that were discussed in that Roe v. Wade decision. There is currently a case pending before Florida courts, Florida appellate courts, and the Supreme Court right now to interpret that right of privacy and to see whether it applies to actions the state of Florida takes on reproductive rights and abortion and those sorts of issues. So the legislature looks like it may take action and move it down to 6 weeks, but this is ultimately going to be decided in the courts as the courts decide whether that right of privacy that's in the Florida Constitution prevents the legislature from further restricting the amount of time one can have to get an abortion in this state. We've seen this in other states as well. For example, in recent months, the state of South Carolina, they also have a right to privacy in their Constitution. Their Supreme Court in South Carolina struck down restrictions on abortion, saying that the right of privacy in their state of their Constitution prevents the legislature from taking that action. So regardless of what happens in Tallahassee this session, there is going to be a legal battle to decide what the state of Florida Constitution says and how that regulates the issue of abortion.
So, Chris, we got a minute or two left, but I mentioned other things going on there in the state legislature, these universal school vouchers, constitutional carry, affordable housing, higher education changes. What are kind of key topics that you're watching as we go through the rest of this session?
Well, the higher education changes have received a lot of attention. And of course, all those subjects you named are very important, Kent. But the higher education ones, because they would affect every state college and every state university in Florida. There's a couple of different pieces to that. One would abolish any diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in state universities and prohibit the types of certain teaching, but would also affect things like faculty tenure, would move the hiring of professors from university presidents to university boards of trustees, and also would subject faculty members to tenure review at any time for any reason. There's a lot of concern that some of those provisions would impinge on academic freedom and perhaps dissuade faculty members from taking positions at Florida institutions or from staying at Florida institutions. This, of course, comes on the heels of some of the controversial action that's occurred at New College, the Public Honors College in Sarasota. So I think that's going to receive a lot of state and national attention. Some of these higher education changes, we'll have to see where the Florida legislature ultimately comes down on that when session ends in early May.
So one of the things you mentioned, I think we're going to talk about in our next segment, you said, you talked about the abortion law or whatever. Hey, this is being fought in the courts. There are a number of issues in Florida that are being battled out in the courts, and so we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Stay with us. And we want to offer you a little bit more from that interview with Senator Tracy Davis. You're going to find her view on the different facets of the 6-week abortion ban and that bill when you join us on News 4 Jax Plus. It's available on Roku, Apple TV, Fire Stick, Android TV, and Chromecast. You search News 4 Jax on your streaming device and download it, and then once you're there, you're going to find that interview under This Week in Jacksonville's channel. All right, so we've been talking about the House and the Senate, and there's seismic activity taking place at Florida Supreme Court, too. Chris stays with us to explain next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
Chris Hand is with us today. Chris, you're an attorney, and I'd love your perspective on this, on what's happening in the Florida Supreme Court. So I read this week, Justice Ricky Polston plans to retire at the end of the month. He sent the governor a letter Monday, but didn't really give a reason for leaving. So Polston's only 67. He was appointed by Charlie Crist 2008, seen as one of the court's most conservative justices. What does this mean that a Supreme Court justice is going to step aside? How does the process look like, too?
Well, that's right. Well, obviously, this is something that happens periodically. It's happened a fair amount during Governor DeSantis' term. When he appoints a successor to Justice Polston, it means Governor DeSantis will have appointed 5 of the 7 Florida Supreme Court justices. That's unusual that a governor's had that many appointments to the Florida Supreme Court. So this court is really going to be primarily composed of Ron DeSantis appointees. The process is lawyers and other judges now apply for that. We have in Florida a process called the Judicial Nominating Commission, which is a series of appointed members who accept applications, screen them, conduct interviews, and then send a series of candidates, usually no more than about 6, to the governor for him to select the next Supreme Court appointee. There's no role for the legislature in this. This is purely the governor's appointment. So I'm sure very soon the Judicial Nominating Commission will convene, accept those applications, conduct interviews, send finalists to the governor for his review, and then he will select the next member of the Florida Supreme Court.
Is this stacking the deck for Governor DeSantis? If he's going to have 5 people that he's nominated or put forth, appointed, I guess, to the Supreme Court.
Well, this is just, I mean, vacancies fall during a certain particular term. He happened to have 3 to fill when he first got into office because there were 3 justices who, they had reached the kind of constitutional limit of amount of time they could serve. So he had some early appointments. He's made more since then. He's just happened to have a number of vacancies, but it's clearly something of great importance to the governor's office. Because obviously a governor has great power to kind of help shape not only the executive branch and the legislative branch, but also the judicial branch of government. He's happened to have several vacancies fall during his term in office. Justice Polston's resignation or retirement is the next one. And so, sometime over the next few months, Governor DeSantis will appoint a new member to the Florida Supreme Court.
And if we're running out of time, but if you want to see your government branches separate or independent, does it look like that's not happening here? And we only have about 30 seconds left, but doesn't it seem like maybe what's happening is coordinated to tilt that branch of government in one favor, or it's the favor of one side or another?
Well, again, I think what's happened is you've happened to have several vacancies that have occurred during Governor DeSantis' term, and he has filled those vacancies, I'm sure, with people who share his judicial and legal philosophy as well. So there's no question the court has shifted to some extent because those appointments have been made. But again, these are appointments that occurred. The first several were as a result of people having to leave office per the Florida Constitution. Justice Polston had served for almost 15 years, not unusual for a justice to kind of resign after that amount of time. Governor DeSantis has made those appointments. He'll make the next one in the next coming months.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for your time today on our Hand on Government segment. So next week, among other ideas, we're getting you ready for spring treats like the start of baseball. Our interview, that is, with the Jumbo Shrimp owner, Ken Babby. That's on the agenda. And This Week in Jacksonville airs each Sunday morning at this time. I'm Kent Justice, so thank you for watching on air on Channel 4 and the CW17, and online, that is, at news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus. If you're only joining me Sundays for This Week in Jacksonville, don't miss out. Be sure to subscribe to my weekly Twidge newsletter. Real bonus for News4Jax insiders. We'll see you next time.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.